In the autumn of 1908, a crew of 5 men was busy dismantling the final remaining cabin on the former Ravenel Bluff Plantation, situated in the low country of South Carolina. They drove their crowbars into a wall that had been sealed shut, coated in tar, and given 3 separate layers of whitewash over the course of 45 years. The man who had ordered it closed back in March of 1863 had been deceased for quite some time. His widow had passed the winter before. The deed to the property had changed hands on 4 different occasions, and with every new owner, the previous overseer of the Ravenel family made a point of telling them that the little structure at the edge of the rice field could be torn down, but under no circumstances should it ever be unsealed. When that first plank came loose on that October afternoon, the foreman pulled back as an odor drifted out into the pine-scented air. 2 of the younger workers made the sign of the cross. The eldest among them, a freedman by the name of Solomon Pinkney, born on a neighboring plantation in 1847, laid down his crowbar and murmured that he had been waiting 60 years to find out what lay behind that wall. What they uncovered inside that cabin would later compel a county coroner to come out of retirement, generate a series of newspaper pieces that were withdrawn from circulation within 3 weeks, and expose a crime that the Ravenel family had devoted 2 generations and a considerable sum of money to concealing behind pine boards and outward piety. Before we continue with the tale of Ravenel Bluff and the cabin that had stayed shut since 1863, be sure to subscribe to this channel and leave a comment telling us which state you're tuning in from at this moment. Hearing from all of you across the country serves as a reminder of why these narratives must never be allowed to fade. And now, to grasp what rested behind that barrier, we need to turn back to the spring of 1849, when Ravenel Bluff was still viewed as one of the most thriving rice estates along the tidal stretch of the Combahee River. The plantation occupied a high bank of sandy loam that overlooked nearly 300 acres of flooded rice paddies, flanked on the east by a dense thicket of cypress and live oak draped with Spanish moss, and on the west by a low tidal creek that swelled and receded with the salty, rhythmic pull of the Atlantic. That spring, the low country air was heavy with the scent of mud and blooming jasmine. At night, the rice fields echoed with the croaking of bullfrogs and the slow, steady clicking of rice birds descending from the Carolina Piedmont to feast on the spring shoots. To the north, the Combahee River wound between its banks of dark water and tangled palmetto, its surface interrupted every few yards by the log-like shapes of alligators basking in the extended afternoon sunlight. Within the geography of the antebellum South, this stood as one of the wealthiest tracts of land in the nation. A single acre of Combahee rice, at the price it fetched in the Charleston markets of 1849, held more value than most free white farmers in the upcountry could earn over an entire year. The main house was a 2-story Greek Revival structure, painted that distinct shade of white that only the truly affluent could afford to preserve in such a humid environment. Its columns were fashioned from heart pine, and its long verandas were shaded by the same live oaks that had already been ancient when the first European settlers traversed the area in the 1690s. The interior was adorned with pieces that Augustine Ravenel's grandfather had imported from Philadelphia and New Orleans, mahogany writing desks, a broadwood pianoforte in the front parlor, and a sideboard of French walnut transported from Richmond on a coastal schooner in 1811. The floors were heart pine, the walls plastered and painted the shade of aged cream. Above the dining room fireplace hung an oil portrait of Augustine's father, Colonel Pierre Ravenel, who had served under General Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans. His stern gaze fell upon every family meal with an intensity that Augustine Ravenel, as a child, had found hard to endure. Behind the main house, arranged in a neat double row along a packed earth lane, were the plantation's 12 slave cabins. These modest structures were built of rough-cut cypress planks and roofed with hand-split shingles, each one housing between 4 and 8 individuals who, under the laws of South Carolina that year, were classified as the personal property of Mr. Augustine Ravenel. The cabins had dirt floors, a single fireplace at one end, and small unglazed windows covered with oiled cloth at night. In summer, they were thick with the odors of sweat and smoke and the resinous breath of the pine forest just beyond the fence. In winter, they grew cold enough that the children would pile 3 to a pallet for warmth. Between the cabins and the main house ran an invisible boundary that every person on the plantation recognized without any need for words. On one side lay the world of the Ravenel family, the world of ledger books, Sunday dinners, and letters written on cream-laid paper. The other side held the world of labor, survival, and the long memory of a people brought to that place from a continent most had never laid eyes on and would never see again. Augustine Ravenel was 46 years old in the spring of 1849. He was the third generation of his family to hold the plantation, descended from a Huguenot merchant who had fled France in the 1680s, settled in Charleston, and then moved inland to the rice country. Augustine was a tall, narrow-shouldered man with sandy hair graying at the temples and a habit, noted by every neighbor who ever dined at his table, of chewing the inside of his cheek when discontented. His wife, Henrietta Bonneau Ravenel, was 7 years his junior, educated in the French tradition at a finishing school in Charleston and recognized among the wives of the low country gentry for her strict adherence to the social codes of her rank. They had 3 children, a daughter, Clotilda, who was 12 that spring, a son, Augustine Jr., who was 9, and a younger boy, Lawrence, aged 4. According to that year's census, the plantation held 47 enslaved people. Among them was a man named Ezekiel, the head driver of the field hands, born on the plantation in 1809. His father before him had been brought in chains from the windward coast of Africa in 1787. Ezekiel knew every inch of the rice fields, every function of the trunk gates that regulated the tidal flow, and the name of every individual who lived in the cabins. In the unspoken hierarchy of the enslaved community, he was the person the others turned to when a child fell ill or when a dispute needed resolution without the overseer's involvement. He was 40 years old that spring, a broad-shouldered man with hands so calloused that he had lost most sensation in his fingertips. He moved through the world with the careful patience of someone who had learned at a young age never to waste a movement or a word. There was also a woman named Clarissa, who ran the kitchen and was regarded by Henrietta Ravenel as essential. Clarissa was 52 that spring. She had been a girl of 8 when she was purchased by Colonel Pierre Ravenel at the Charleston market in 1805, separated on that very afternoon from her mother, whose name she could no longer recall by the time she reached middle age. Over the decades, Clarissa had made herself the most skilled cook in the parish. Her shrimp pillau was renowned from Beaufort to Charleston. She baked penny wafers that Henrietta served to the visiting wives of state senators. She knew every herb that flourished in the kitchen garden, every remedy for a child's fever, and every measurement of every ingredient in every recipe she had ever learned. And she also knew how to listen. The kitchen was where the main house and the quarters met, and Clarissa had spent 44 years of her life standing at that crossroads, absorbing everything that passed between those two realms and holding it in memory. And there was a young woman named Delia, 18 years old that spring, whose mother had succumbed to the fever the year before. Delia had been assigned to the main house as nursery maid to the youngest Ravenel child. She was tall for a woman of her era, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed older than her years, along with a cautious stillness about her that her fellow servants had come to respect. She did not speak unless spoken to, she did not laugh where it could be overheard. But she sang very softly to little Lawrence when she put him to bed at night, old songs in a gullah patois that her grandmother had carried from the sea islands. The child would fall asleep with his hand wrapped around one of her fingers, as if he had known her all his life. Delia's grandmother, whose name was Bina, had told her in childhood that the songs predated every one of them, older than the plantations, older even than the ships that had brought their ancestors across the ocean. And she said that so long as a single child somewhere could still hear those melodies, they would never perish. Delia held that belief close. Singing those tunes over the cradle of a white child not her own was, in some hidden recess of her heart, the sole means she had of preserving her grandmother's memory. The Ravenel family gave no thought to Delia. They gave no thought to any of the people who served them. The machinery of the plantation simply existed, as naturally as the tide, as the heat, as the presence of God was said to be. Henrietta Ravenel recognized her house servants by face and function, yet she could not have named a single field hand if asked. Augustine maintained more detailed records, but only because records equated to money. In his study, within a leather-bound ledger stamped with the family crest, he recorded every purchase, every birth, and every death among the people he owned, in the same orderly columns he used for livestock acquisitions and seed prices. There was no distinction in the architecture of his thinking between the two categories. And on a plantation of 47 souls, a young woman in a cotton head wrap who sang to the baby was less noticeable than the furniture she polished each morning. The politics of the Low Country in 1849 were already beginning to constrict around the edges of this existence. In the Charleston newspapers delivered to Ravenel Bluff by courier each Wednesday, Augustine read with growing frequency about abolitionist agitation in the North, about the congressional debates over slavery in the new Western territories, about the fury of Senator Calhoun and the anxious calculations of the great cotton planters. The nullification crisis of the 1830s remained a fresh memory. The Mexican War had recently concluded. The Compromise of 1850 was still a year away. Augustine Ravenel, like most of his class, held with an unshakable conviction that the Southern way of life was divinely ordained and economically essential, and he stood ready, if required, to defend it. He did not yet realize that within 12 years, his country would fracture over the very question of whether he should be allowed to continue owning the woman who dusted his desk. And Delia, who knew nothing of the debates in Washington, went on singing to his youngest son in the nursery, making the little boy laugh and helping him survive the fevers of his early years. Because that was the task she had been given. And because the boy, in his own way, had become what made her own existence bearable. This was the ordinary world of Ravenel Bluff in the spring of 1849. A realm of rice and rhetoric, of mint juleps on the veranda and Sunday sermons at the parish church in Beaufort district, of immaculate ledger books in Augustine's study recording every bushel, every birth, and every acquisition, both of livestock and of human beings. It was a world its inhabitants believed would endure forever. And yet, it was a world poised to split apart along a fracture no one in the main house had yet perceived. The fracture began in the summer of 1852 when Augustine Ravenel's youngest son, Lawrence, succumbed to yellow fever at the age of 7. The fever arrived in Beaufort district that season during one of the worst outbreaks the region had experienced since the epidemic of 1817. It swept through the low-lying plantations along the Combahee River as fever had always moved through that country, through the mosquito-thick air of the August dusk, striking the youngest and the oldest first. At Ravenel Bluff, it claimed 3 people over the course of 2 weeks. An elderly field hand named Old Moses died on the 11th of August. A 4-year-old girl in the second cabin died on the 15th. And on the morning of the 21st, little Lawrence Ravenel awoke with a flushed face and a temperature that made Delia's hand recoil when she touched his forehead. The boy lasted 8 days. For the first 3, he fluctuated between fever and chills. He asked for his mother, who could not be reached in time, and for Delia, who never left his side. By the 5th day, the disease had entered its second phase, the yellowing of his eyes, the vomiting of black matter that gave yellow fever its old name of vomito negro. Delia, now 21, held him through each convulsion with a composure that the household physician, Dr. Franklin Lessesson, would later describe in a letter to Henrietta Ravenel as remarkable. When Lawrence could no longer speak, Delia clasped his hand and sang to him the same song she had sung when he was an infant, a song about the river that flowed to the sea, about the woman who transformed into a bird. She sang until her voice gave out, and then she hummed. And then she simply held him. Henrietta Ravenel was in Charleston when the child died, visiting her sister. Augustine was in the study. It was Delia who closed the boy's eyes, who washed his small body with rosewater, who wrapped him in the linen set aside for the purpose, and who did not weep in front of the physician because she knew no one in the main house would expect her to. In the weeks that followed, something shifted within the main house. Henrietta returned from Charleston 3 days after her son's burial, collapsed in the front hall of the plantation house, and had to be carried upstairs. She did not leave her bedroom for nearly 4 months. The nursery curtains were drawn. The toys were wrapped in muslin and packed away in a trunk. The house was draped in black crepe, the mirrors turned to face the wall, and the mantel clock stopped at the hour of the boy's death. Augustine, who had been distant from his children for most of their lives, began to spend long hours in the nursery where his youngest son had died, sitting in the rocking chair Delia had once used. He drank more than he ever had before. He slept poorly. He snapped at his daughter Clotilda, who was 15 that summer and had begun to fear her father in a way she never previously had. And Delia, who had nowhere else to go, was often in that same nursery, folding small clothes that would never be worn again, dusting a rocking horse that would never again be ridden. What transpired between them in that nursery over the following year did not happen because either of them chose it in any sense that a free person would recognize as choice. Augustine Ravenel was the man who owned her under the laws of South Carolina in 1852. There was no such thing as the rape of an enslaved woman by her enslaver, because the word rape required a violation of the victim's will, and the law did not recognize that an enslaved woman possessed a will that could be violated. This was not a private opinion of the Ravenel family, it was the written law of the state, upheld by every court in the republic south of the Mason-Dixon line, and most famously articulated by Judge Thomas Ruffin of North Carolina in the case of State v. Mann in 1829, when the judge wrote that the power of the master must be absolute in order to render the submission of the slave perfect. Under the cover of that law, under the cover of his wife's grief, under the cover of the quiet rooms of a house draped in mourning cloth, Augustine Ravenel began a relationship with the young woman who had held his dying son. Delia did not resist him. A woman in her position did not resist, because a woman in her position who resisted would be whipped or sold or worse. She did what she had always done, she went silent. She sang in her own mind one of her grandmother's old songs, and she waited for it to be over. When she walked back to her cabin afterward, in the darkness of the lane between the quarters, she moved without making any sound at all. She had learned by the age of 22 that the body could be separated from the self if you were careful, if you were very careful, and if you kept singing. In the autumn of 1853, Delia was pregnant. She was 22 years old. She told no one. The other women in the cabin saw the shape of her body changing beneath her apron and knew, as women have always known. Clarissa, who ran the kitchen, took her aside one evening behind the smokehouse and asked whose it was. Delia did not answer. She did not have to. Clarissa had lived on Ravenel Bluff for 31 years, she had seen this before. She had seen what happened to the women it happened to, and what became of the children. Clarissa, who had laid 3 of her own children to rest and watched a 4th, a girl of 12, be sold off to a plantation in Alabama, fixed her gaze on Delia for a long while in the crimson light of the setting sun. Then she clasped the younger woman's hand in her own and murmured that no matter what came, she would stand by her. She spoke softly. She said it only once. Then she returned to the kitchen and never mentioned it again. The child arrived in the spring of 1854, in the slave quarters, in the smallest cabin at the Rose End, the one Delia had been given after her mother's death. The midwife was an elderly woman named Grace, who had brought more than 100 babies into the world on that plantation and its neighbors over the course of her long life. The labor stretched on for hours. Delia made scarcely a sound. When the child finally came, just before dawn on an April morning, he emerged quietly, eyes already open, fixing on the lantern as though he had been anticipating it. It was a boy. Delia named him Isaac, after her grandfather, who had been transported to the Sea Islands on a vessel whose name no one in his family had ever learned. The boy had fair skin, hair the color of wet sand, and eyes that would, as he matured, shift to the same pale gray as Augustine Ravenel's. When Grace beheld the infant, she looked at Delia and needed no explanation. She bathed the baby in a basin of warm water, wrapped him in a fresh linen cloth, placed him in his mother's arms, then settled onto the wooden stool beside the bed and whispered that the child bore the mark of someone whose life would require careful guarding. Delia nodded. She already understood. Henrietta Ravenel knew as well. She could scarcely avoid it. The child was far too conspicuous, the plantation too confined, and the knowing glances of the other servants too telling for her to feign ignorance. For several weeks following Isaac's birth, Henrietta did not appear at breakfast. When she finally did, on a late April morning, she did not address her husband across the table, nor did she speak to him in any meaningful way for nearly a year. But Henrietta was a woman of her class and era. The resolution to such a problem, among the planter families of the Low Country, was not to confront it. Divorce was out of the question. Scandal was unthinkable. The solution was to keep the mother in the cabin at the far end of the row, to claim the child belonged to some nameless field hand, and to wait for the years to blur the resemblance into something that could be politely overlooked. And for 8 years, that was precisely what they did. Delia raised Isaac in the cabin at the row's end. Augustine continued, intermittently and in a pattern that only Delia, and perhaps Clarissa, would have recognized, to visit her. Henrietta inhabited the main house, conducted her social engagements, took communion at the parish church, and never uttered her husband's name in connection with the child in the cabin. Isaac grew. He learned to walk, to talk, and from the other children in the quarters, the delicate art of vanishing whenever a white person drew near. By the time he was 7, he was the most silent child on the plantation, yet within the private world of his mother's cabin, he was also a child who laughed. Delia had carved out a small universe for him, with Clarissa's assistance and the help of the other women of the quarters, a realm entirely his own. She had secretly taught him to read from a worn Bible that Clarissa had smuggled from the main house and stitched into the lining of Delia's mattress. She had taught him to count using dried beans from a kitchen jar. She had taught him the old songs. And she had taught him, in the careful language an enslaved mother used to prepare her son for survival, when to speak and when to remain silent, when to lower his head and when to hold a white man's gaze, when to laugh and when to keep his face as still as a pond at dawn. By his 8th year, he had mastered all these lessons. He was a quick child and an observant one. Delia sometimes watched him sleeping at night in the amber glow of a single tallow candle and thought, with a grief she had no word for, that he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. And that the world into which he had been born was bound to destroy him. And that she could not envision a future in which this would not prove true. Ezekiel, the head driver, was one of the few people on the plantation who addressed the boy directly. In the long evenings of spring and summer, when the day's labor was done, Ezekiel would sometimes come to the end of the lane where Delia's cabin stood, sit on the wooden step outside the door, and tell Isaac stories. He told him about the river, the birds, the workings of the tide. In a careful, coded manner, he told him about places up north where a man could be free. He did not say the word freedom, he did not have to. Isaac, small and thin, watching the older man with gray eyes already aged beyond his years, understood what was being described. Delia, listening from within, said nothing. She was afraid of what Ezekiel was telling her son, and afraid of what would happen if he did not tell him. Then, in the summer of 1862, everything shifted. The war had reached the Sea Islands. The Union Navy had taken Port Royal the previous November, landing troops in the area and on the surrounding islands, sending the white population of the region fleeing toward the interior. Confederate planters up and down the coast were beginning to grasp that their world was collapsing. The great plantations of the Sea Islands had been abandoned. The enslaved people left behind had been declared contraband of war by General Benjamin Butler, and then, in January of 1863, declared free by the Emancipation Proclamation. News of all this filtered to the plantations along the Combahee River through channels the planters could not control. It reached the kitchens, then the stables, then, within days, the cabins. Augustine Ravenel, now 59 and 30 pounds lighter than the year before, began to drink in the evenings in a manner his wife and daughter pretended not to notice. He sat up late in his study with the ledgers open before him, staring at columns of figures representing a form of wealth he now understood was about to be stripped from him. He wrote long letters to his banker in Charleston and to his brother-in-law in Richmond. He slept, when he slept at all, in the chair by the study fire with a pistol on the desk beside him. The field hands were beginning to disappear, slipping away at night toward the Union lines, and no amount of patrolling could halt them. In April of 1862, 3 young men from the cabins left together and were never heard from again. In June, a woman named Hannah and her 2 daughters simply were not in their cabin when the bell rang at dawn. Ezekiel, the head driver, who had been with the family since before Augustine inherited the plantation, walked into the woods on the night of August 9, 1862, and never returned. In the weeks prior, he had begun to speak more openly to the younger men of the quarters about what was approaching. Then, on one warm night, he simply stepped out of his cabin and vanished. He was 53 years old. He left behind a wife named Chloe, who would eventually find him again in the fall of 1864 at a contraband camp outside Beaufort, and who would die in his arms of pneumonia in the winter of 1867, a free woman on free land. Augustine Ravenel began to feel fear. It was a distinct, nameable dread. He was afraid of what would happen when the Union Army arrived, and he knew now that it would. He was afraid of his ledgers being examined by Yankee officers. He was afraid of his neighbors, several of whom had already begun to whisper about him in Beaufort society, about the child at the end of the quarters row, about the resemblance that was no longer deniable as the boy grew older. And in a way he had never before permitted himself to consider, he was afraid of Delia and of the child Isaac, now 8 years old, whose face was a daily public record of something Henrietta had spent 9 years pretending did not exist. The war was about to make Delia a free woman, and a free Delia could testify. A free Delia could write her own name if she chose. A free Delia, holding the hand of a light-skinned boy whose features mirrored one of the most prominent planters along the Combahee, was no longer a private embarrassment to be managed behind wooden walls. She was a witness. And witnesses, in the calculus of a man like Augustine Ravenel, were not problems to be reasoned with. They were problems to be eliminated. In the autumn of 1862, Augustine Ravenel began to set things in motion. One evening in October, he informed his wife that Delia had grown insolent and that the time had come to sell her away. Henrietta, who had been anticipating this conversation for 9 years, offered no objection. She asked only that it be done swiftly and that the child accompany her. Augustine agreed. However, he made no contact with any slave trader. The ports were blockaded. The auction houses in Charleston stood empty. And Augustine had begun, in the long evenings of that autumn, to calculate a different kind of arithmetic. What happened next is the heart of what the men discovered behind that wall in 1908. It is the portion of this story the Ravenel family spent 45 years and 2 generations attempting to conceal. I want to pause here for a moment to ask, if this story is drawing you in, to hit that like button and leave a comment with your thoughts so far. The algorithm only shares these narratives with more people when you engage. There are descendants of families like Delia scattered across this country who deserve to have their histories heard. Keep watching, because what I am about to tell you is the piece of the story Augustine Ravenel paid to keep buried. On the night of January 17, 1863, according to the testimony Solomon Pinkney would later give to the Beaufort County coroner on October 29, 1908, Augustine Ravenel came to the cabin at the end of the row with a bottle of imported French brandy, a folded document bearing the seal of a Charleston notary, and 2 men from a neighboring plantation whom Solomon did not recognize. Solomon was 15 at the time. He was in the adjacent cabin, separated from Delia's by a single plank wall, and he heard everything. His grandmother, a woman named Flora, who had raised him after his mother's death, lay asleep on the other side of the small room, worn down by a cough that would claim her before the winter's end. Solomon was wide awake. He had been wide awake on most nights that January. He was a boy who listened. Augustine told Delia he had purchased her freedom. He showed her the notarized document. He explained that he had arranged for her and the boy Isaac to be taken by wagon that night to a safe house in Walterboro, and from there to Charleston, where they would board a ship bound for Liverpool. He said the war would soon be over and that she could not be here when it ended. He claimed he had provided a sum of money sufficient to begin a new life. He asked her to pack what she needed and to wake the boy. Through the wall, Solomon heard Augustine's voice with clarity. It was the voice of a man attempting to sound generous while simultaneously sounding like a man who had made a decision he did not intend to reverse. Solomon had heard that voice many times in his short life. It was the voice white men used when they had already determined the outcome of a conversation and what the other person said did not matter. Delia did as she was told. Solomon heard her through the wall, moving quietly in the dark, telling the child in that low singing voice that they were going on a journey, that he should be brave, that he should be very quiet. He heard her wrap a small bundle of clothes. He heard her strike a match to light the stub of a candle so she could find the child's shoes. He heard the child ask if they were going to see the ocean. He heard her say yes, they were going to see the ocean. Solomon, in the darkness of his own cabin, began to pray. He did not know precisely why. He could not have articulated what was wrong, but something in the arrangement of voices on the other side of the wall had settled a cold weight in his chest that would not lift. Then Solomon heard the two men from the neighboring plantation enter the cabin. What occurred in that cabin over the next half hour is the thing the wall was built to hide. Solomon, through the plank wall, heard it all. He heard the child cry out once, a small, high sound of surprise more than fear, because the child had not yet understood what was about to unfold. He heard Delia scream, a single scream cut short. He heard a sound he would not be able to describe to the coroner 45 years later without stopping and asking for water, a heavy sound, a wet sound, and then a second, smaller version of the same sound. And then, for a very long time, silence. Solomon did not move. His grandmother slept through all of it, because she was old and her cough had exhausted her, and because the human body will sometimes refuse at the end of a long life to wake for sounds the waking mind could not survive. Solomon lay in the dark with the cold weight in his chest, and he did not cry, and he did not move, and he listened to the silence on the other side of the wall as if he could, by listening hard enough, will the silence to become something else. It did not. Before dawn, Augustine Ravenel and the two men left the cabin. They went to the carriage house. They returned with tools. For the rest of that night and into the gray of the next morning, Solomon listened through the wall to the sound of hammers, of boards being nailed across the inside of the door, of tar being brushed over the seams, and of a wooden bar being driven across the outside of the cabin and sealed with nails as long as a man's hand. When Solomon dared, near noon, to look out through a knothole in his own cabin wall, he saw three men whitewashing the exterior of the sealed cabin with the slurry of lime and pine tar. Their faces were set in a way that told him, even at 15, that they were not men who had done something they would admit to in daylight. Augustine Ravenel told the remaining enslaved people on the plantation that Delia and her boy had been sold in the night to a trader bound for Cuba. He said the cabin had been sealed because of fever. He said no one was to go near it. He said anyone caught near that cabin would be whipped within an inch of their life. And then, because the war was coming and there was no time for sentiment, he moved on. 6 months later, in July of 1863, Augustine Ravenel was dead. He had been thrown from a horse on the river road, his neck broken against a fence post, and he died where he fell. With no last confession, no last arrangement, no last alteration to the will he had signed in 1861, his widow, Henrietta, inherited the plantation. The Union Army reached the Combahee River in the late summer of that year during the raid led by Harriet Tubman and Colonel James Montgomery, and 32 of the remaining 39 enslaved people at Ravenel Bluff walked away toward the gunboats and were free. Solomon Pinkney was among them. He was 15 years old. For the next 45 years, the sealed cabin at the end of the row stood where Augustine Ravenel had left it. Henrietta Ravenel, who lived until the winter of 1907, never spoke of it. Her surviving children, Clotilda and Augustine Jr., grew up knowing only that their father had ordered the cabin sealed because of fever, and that it was not to be touched. When Clotilda married a Charleston physician in 1868 and moved away, she did not look back at it. When Augustine Jr. inherited the plantation in his mother's last years, he did not look at it either. The cabin was whitewashed a second time in 1881 during a general repainting of the outbuildings, and a third time in 1899 when the plantation was first put up for sale. Each time, the workmen were told by the estate's overseer, an old man named Claiborne Huger, who had served the Ravenels since before the war, that the cabin was to be painted over, but never opened. Claiborne Huger died in 1906. He took what he knew with him. Decades passed. The fields grew up in pine saplings and broom sedge. The main house, which had been grand in 1849, settled and sagged on its foundations by 1908. The plantation had been sold twice and was in the hands of a timber company out of Savannah that had no use for it except to harvest the last of the live oak and pine and then subdivide the rest for small farms. The timber company engaged a local foreman by the name of Edgar Fripp to dismantle the outbuildings. Edgar Fripp assembled a crew of 5 men on the morning of October the 27th, 1908. That crew made their way down the old packed earth lane between the rows of collapsed cabins and arrived at the one at the end of the row. The one that had received 3 coats of whitewash. The one that stood slightly apart from the others. The one no one in Beaufort County could recall ever having seen opened. Edgar Fripp, a pragmatic man unburdened by superstition, instructed his crew to tear it down. He knew nothing of the wall built on the interior of the cabin. He assumed it was merely another slave cabin, dozens of which dotted abandoned plantations up and down the coast, and expected it to fall within 20 minutes. Just when we thought we had grasped the story of Ravenel Bluff, the horror sealed within that cabin is about to emerge into the daylight for the first time in 45 years. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share this video with a friend who appreciates dark American history. Hit that like button to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a tale like this one. What Edgar Fripp's crew was about to uncover will alter everything. The first strike of the crowbar against the outer wall of the cabin came down just after 11 in the morning. The plank splintered with ease. The wood was old, cypress cut from the river bottom 60 years earlier, and it gave way with the dry crack of something that had been waiting a long time to fall. The second blow brought down a second board. The third exposed what at first appeared to be a second wall, perhaps 18 inches behind the first, nailed up from the inside with boards of the same cypress plank, the seams sealed with black tar that had hardened to the consistency of stone. The men paused. They had all seen the outside of the cabin whitewashed 3 times over, but none of them had anticipated a second wall. Edgar Fripp stepped forward and ran his hand along the inner wall. He drew back his fingers, smelled them, then looked at Solomon Pinkney, the oldest man on the crew and the only one among them who had been alive in 1863. The younger workers, who had started the morning joking among themselves about how quickly the job would proceed, had fallen utterly silent. One of them, a man named Jessup, removed his hat and began to turn it slowly in his hands. Another, the youngest, a boy of 19 named Caleb, took several steps back from the cabin without seeming to realize he was doing it. The autumn light slanted through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called 3 times and fell silent. Solomon, who had been awaiting this moment for 45 years, said nothing. He took the crowbar from the younger man nearest him, walked up to the inner wall, set the bar against the seam between 2 boards, and pulled. His hands, which had aged on their own schedule, were trembling. He had to set the bar a second time before he could gain leverage. When the board finally came loose, it came away with a long tearing sound, like fabric being ripped in half. The odor that emerged was not the smell of fever. It was not the smell of any illness Edgar Fripp had encountered in his 41 years. It was the dry, dusty, faintly sweet scent of something that had been sealed in darkness for nearly half a century. And it carried the particular and unmistakable weight of the human dead. It was, Edgar Fripp would later say in an interview that was never published, a smell a man could recognize even if he had never smelled it before, because some part of the human mind knew it the way the body knew hunger or thirst. Solomon Pinkney, who had smelled it before in the hospitals of the war years, took 2 steps back from the opening and sat down on a fallen log. His face had gone gray. Edgar Fripp ordered the crew to stop. He sent the youngest worker, Caleb, running on foot 2 miles through the pine woods to the nearest telephone at the general store in Green Pond with instructions to call the Beaufort County Sheriff and the county coroner. Then Edgar Fripp, Solomon Pinkney, and the 3 remaining men sat down on the ground 20 feet from the cabin and waited. No one spoke. Solomon Pinkney, according to an account given later to a reporter from the Charleston News and Courier, removed his hat, held it in both hands, and did not put it back on for the rest of the afternoon. Jessup, who was a Methodist, prayed quietly under his breath. Edgar Fripp, who was not a religious man, smoked 3 cigarettes in succession and stared at the broken wall of the cabin as if trying to commit it to memory. A squirrel ran down the trunk of the nearest pine, saw the men, and scrambled back up without making a sound. The sheriff, whose name was Osgood Hayward, arrived at Ravenel Bluff just after 2:05 in the afternoon, accompanied by the county coroner, a physician named Dr. Rutherford Stewart, who had officially retired from the coroner's office 2 years before but still served on the most serious cases because there was no one else in the county with his experience. Dr. Stewart was 68 years old. He was a thin, white-haired man with a clipped manner of speaking and pale eyes that missed little. He had been a Confederate Army surgeon at Fredericksburg, at Chickamauga, and through the long, terrible winter of the siege of Petersburg. He had witnessed more death than most men could fathom. He approached the broken wall of the cabin with a handkerchief pressed to his nose and mouth, went inside with a kerosene lantern, and came out 11 minutes later with an expression on his face that the sheriff would describe in his written report as the look of a man who had just been shown something he had hoped never to see. He walked a short distance from the cabin, leaned against the trunk of a live oak, and stood there for a full 2 minutes without speaking. When he turned back, his voice was steady, but his hands were not. What Dr. Stewart found inside that cabin, and what he would document in the county coroner's report of October 30, 1908, was this. The cabin was a single room, approximately 12 feet by 14 feet, with a packed earth floor, a small hearth at one end, and a narrow loft accessed by a wooden ladder. The interior had been stripped of all furniture except for a single iron bed frame standing against the far wall. On the bed frame, arranged with a care that struck Dr. Stewart as the most disturbing element of the entire scene, were the remains of 2 human beings. One was an adult female, determined by the dimensions of the pelvis and the development of the skull to have been approximately 18 to 25 years of age at the time of death. The other was a child male between 7 and 9 years of age. The remains had been almost entirely mummified by the sealed dry conditions of the cabin, which had kept out moisture and scavengers for 45 years. The skin had become the color and texture of old parchment. The hair was still attached to the scalps. The clothing, a simple cotton dress on the woman, a linen shirt and wool trousers on the boy, was intact, though faded and brittle. The woman's arms were positioned around the child, whose head rested against her shoulder. They had been placed that way after death. Dr. Stewart was certain of this because the arrangement of the limbs was too composed to have occurred during any struggle. Someone, he noted in his report, had taken the time to lay them together in something that approximated a posture of rest, and had then built a wall around them and gone home. On the skull of the woman, at the left temple, there was a clearly visible fracture consistent with a single heavy blow from a blunt object. On the skull of the child, at the back of the head, there was a similar fracture. The bones of both bodies were otherwise intact with no evidence of struggle, no defensive wounds to the forearms, no displaced limbs. Whatever had been done to them had been carried out swiftly. This was, Dr. Stewart noted, a mercy of a kind, though the word mercy was one he did not employ without unease in this context. On a small wooden table beside the bed lay a folded piece of paper, brittle with age but still decipherable. It was a notarized bill of manumission dated January 15, 1863, signed by Augustine Ravenel, granting freedom to one Delia, 22 years of age, and her son Isaac, 8 years of age. The document bore the seal of a Charleston notary, a man named Francis Gadsden, who had died in 1879, but whose records had been preserved in the Charleston County Archives, and whose signature matched the one on the document precisely. Beside the paper rested a small leather pouch containing 37 silver coins, mostly Mexican and Spanish pieces of 8, dated between 1821 and 1859, a year's wages for a free laborer in 1863. Enough to begin a life if you were willing to work and if you were careful. Beside the pouch lay a single object wrapped in muslin cloth. When Dr. Stewart unwrapped it, he found a child's wooden horse carved by hand from what appeared to be live oak, smoothed by years of a small palm closing around it. The mane had been carved in fine detail. The tail had been notched with the care of a man who had loved the making of small things. Stuck to the underside of the horse, where it had been scratched into the wood with something sharp, were 2 initials, I.N.R. Isaac Ravenel. Dr. Stewart emerged from the cabin, sat down on the earth beside Solomon Pinkney, and did not speak for a long while. The two old men, the white doctor and the black freedman, sat side by side on the ground in the October sunlight without looking at each other. The sheriff and the remaining workmen stood a respectful distance away and did not interrupt them. At last, Solomon looked at him and asked, in the careful voice he had used to speak to white men all his life, whether the bodies were of a woman and a boy. Dr. Stewart said yes. Solomon asked whether the boy had light hair. Dr. Stewart said he could not be certain because of the condition of the remains, but that what hair was present appeared to be fair. Solomon nodded once and then he began to cry. He was 76 years old. He had not cried, according to his grandchildren who were later interviewed, in any of their lifetimes. He cried without sound for nearly 20 minutes. Then he stood up, put his hat back on, and told Sheriff Hayward and Dr. Stewart what he had heard on the night of January the 17th, 1863. He told it slowly in the same careful voice, stopping twice to ask for water. He named the men. He described the sounds. He described with an accuracy later corroborated by the coroner's findings exactly where the bodies had been placed on the bed, which one had been killed first, and how he knew. When he was finished, Sheriff Hayward removed his own hat, and the three men stood together in the long October shadows and did not speak for a long time. The investigation that followed lasted exactly 17 days, and then it was over. The Beaufort County Sheriff, Osgood Hayward, took Solomon Pinkney's statement on the evening of October the 29th, 1908, and filed it with the county court. Dr. Stewart filed his coroner's report on the 30th. Both documents clearly named Augustine Ravenel, deceased in 1863, as the probable perpetrator, and named two further individuals, yet unidentified, as his accomplices. The local paper, the Beaufort Gazette, ran a story on the morning of October the 31st under the headline, Grim Discovery at Old Ravenel Place, describing the finding of the remains and alluding in the careful language of 1908 South Carolina to the possibility that a crime had been committed. The Charleston News and Courier picked up the story on November the 2nd. A reporter from the Savannah Morning News came to Beaufort County on November the 4th and interviewed Solomon Pinkney at length. And then, on November the 17th, 1908, the story disappeared. The Beaufort Gazette ran no further articles. The Charleston News and Courier printed a brief notice on its back page stating that the remains had been entered at the county's expense in an unmarked grave at a nearby cemetery and that no further investigation was warranted given the death of the principal suspect 45 years previously. The Savannah Morning News never ran the interview its reporter had conducted. When Solomon Pinkney's grandson Samuel Pinkney attempted in 1934 to obtain a copy of Sheriff Hayward's original report from the Beaufort County Courthouse, he was told that the file could not be located. What had happened, it is now possible to piece together from later evidence, was this. Clotilda Ravenel, the daughter of Augustine and Henrietta, was by 1908 a widow living in Charleston and the mother of 3 sons, 2 of whom were prominent figures in South Carolina politics. Her brother Augustine Jr. had died in 1901, but his sons, her nephews, were officers in the state banking system. The Ravenel family had in the 45 years since the war rebuilt its fortune through a combination of timber interests, banking, and marriage. It was not a family that could afford to have a newspaper story circulating about a murder committed by its patriarch. Through mechanisms never documented but not difficult to imagine, the story was made to go away. Sheriff Hayward, who ran for re-election in 1910, did not mention the case in his campaign. Dr. Stewart, who died in 1912, never spoke of it publicly. The reporter from the Savannah Morning News was reassigned to the agricultural desk and left the paper within the year. What the Ravenel family could not control was Solomon Pinkney. Solomon lived until 1927. He was 79 years old when he died. In the last decades of his life, he told the story of what he had heard through the wall on the night of January the 17th, 1863, to anyone who would listen. He told it to his children and his grandchildren. He told it to the members of his church at the African Methodist Episcopal Congregation in Green Pond. He told it, on one occasion in 1921, to a young graduate student from Fisk University who was traveling through the Low Country collecting oral histories of formerly enslaved people and whose notebooks were eventually deposited in a university archive where they were not catalogued until the 1970s. Solomon insisted, every time he told it, on 3 points. First, that Delia had been told she was being freed and had believed it until the moment the other 2 men came into the cabin. Second, that the child, Isaac, had died knowing he was being taken to see the ocean. Third, that Augustine Ravenel had sealed the cabin not out of shame, but out of calculation. He had sealed it because a living woman and a living child, both free and both carrying the evidence of his paternity, could destroy him and his family in a way the corpses behind a plank wall never could. Augustine Ravenel had murdered them not to hide the evidence of his crimes against Delia. He had murdered them because the imminent arrival of the Union Army was about to make her testimony and her son's face into weapons that could be used against him in a court of law and in the court of public opinion. A free Delia walking into a Union camp in the summer of 1863 with a light-skinned boy by her hand and a manumission paper in her pocket would have been one of the most devastating witnesses in the history of the Low Country. Augustine Ravenel had done the arithmetic of his class and his time, and he had decided that it was easier to seal 2 human beings into a wooden box than to face the consequences of having treated them as human beings in the first place. The manumission paper, it turned out, had been real. He had paid to have it drawn up. He had gone through the legal motions of freeing them. And then on the night he had promised them freedom, he had killed them. The paper in the cabin was not evidence of a generous impulse gone wrong. It was evidence of a trap set with care. Delia had believed she was free because Augustine Ravenel had shown her the paper and let her read it. And then once she had believed it, once she had woken her son and told him they were going to see the ocean, he had let in the men who would make certain that no such journey would ever be taken. The woman and the child in the cabin were buried, as the Charleston News and Courier had reported, in an unmarked grave in the county cemetery. In 1998, the Pinkney family, working with a historical preservation society and a team of forensic archaeologists from the University of South Carolina, located the grave. In 2003, after 5 years of legal wrangling with the county, the remains were disinterred, re-identified through careful comparison with the surviving 1908 coroner's photographs, and reburied with headstones. The headstones are plain gray granite, each carved with a single name and, for the first time in either of their lives, a date of death. Delia, 1841, January 17, 1863. Isaac, 1854, January 17, 1863. Alongside them is a third stone added by the Pinkney family in 2004, which reads, in simple lettering, they were told they were free. He lied. Solomon Pinkney heard it through the wall and remembered. The Ravenel Bluff property was developed in the 1950s into a planned subdivision of vacation homes. The main house had burned in a lightning storm in 1931 and was never rebuilt. The slave quarters, including the cabin at the end of the row, had been torn down after the 1908 investigation. Their timbers hauled away and burned in a brush pile at the edge of what had been the rice field. There is a historical marker now, placed in 2009 at the turnoff from the old river road. It notes the existence of the plantation, the names of the people enslaved there, and the discovery of 1908. It does not name the Ravenel family, but the descendants of Augustine Ravenel still live in Charleston. The bank he helped found still operates under a different name on Broad Street. His great-great-grandchildren sit on boards of charitable foundations. They give to historical preservation societies. In the last several years, they have been asked to contribute to the maintenance of the cemetery where Delia and Isaac now lie. And they have, to their credit, quietly done so. The money comes through a trust with no family name attached. It was the granddaughter of Clotilda Ravenel, a historian in her 70s who had spent her career studying the Low Country rice economy, who arranged the trust in 2007. She never spoke publicly about the case, but in a letter to the director of the Historical Preservation Society, released with her permission after her death in 2019, she wrote only this: "My great-grandfather built a wall. It was never going to be strong enough. The voices of the people he sealed behind it have been speaking for 150 years, and my family has been listening whether we admitted it or not. It is past time we answered. There are plantations like Ravenel Bluff up and down the coast of South Carolina and Georgia. Places where the cabins have all been torn down. The fields have grown up in pine, and behind the polite historical markers are stories as sealed in darkness by men who thought they could outlast the memory of what they had done. Some of those stories have come out. Most have not. The cabin at Ravenel Bluff is only one of them. If the story of Delia and Isaac proves anything, it proves that walls do not hold forever, that the men who build them die, and that the voices they tried to silence have a way of reaching the next generation and the generation after that, through the patience of witnesses like Solomon Pinkney, who listened through a plank wall at the age of 15 and carried what he heard for 60 years until the daylight came. What do you think of this story? Do you believe that every wall eventually falls? Or do you think there are crimes that will stay buried forever? Leave your comment below. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and share it with someone who understands that American history is not only what was written in the ledgers, but also what was whispered through the walls. See you in the next video.